Life functions on the basis of information. There is precious little we can do in this world if we do not possess the necessary information to achieve our end. Many go to college or a university in order to learn what they need to know to pursue an occupation. Science, engineering, architecture, biology all require a body of knowledge that is to be learned. If your chosen field does not require a college education, you must still learn that information that is directed toward a non-academic pursuit. You may need to know how to operate a machine, build a house, run a farm or business, and so forth. If you take a trip, you need information to arrive at your destination, the expenses involved, the highways you will take, the distance you will travel, where you will stay the night, and what to do, of course, when you get there. Now, if this is true on a limited personal scale, it must also be true on a larger and broader scale. If you are a citizen of a nation, you automatically incur the duties of citizenship. The whole is equal to the sum of its parts, and if the parts are defective, then the whole will be defective. As a citizen, you will be under some form of government and will be a member of a social structure that must function in harmony with all its parts in order for that society to accomplish the purpose for which it was established in the first place. In this way, the common good is served. We must all possess a unity of purpose and a single-minded mentality that will benefit the nation as a whole. No true society can be broken up into small, special interest groups, each pulling in its own direction, serving only the interests of that particular group. This would go against the very definition of society. Now, if there is one area that requires knowledge, it is the area of government. This may not be true for all forms of government, such as a monarchy, where all power resides in the hands of one man, the king. We as Americans, however, have a unique form of government which provides many advantages to us. But at the same time, being based on self-government, we also incur the responsibility of influencing that government and overseeing it so that state power does not go beyond the limit set out for it in its fundamental laws, which, in our case, is the United States Constitution. Right away, therefore, we see that we have our work cut out for us. We must first know our own laws, which requires a knowledge of the Constitution. We then have to know how this political process works and where our part lies, where our part in it lies. Are proposed laws within the boundaries set by our Constitution, or are they outside of those bounds? We need to determine what men are fit for public office and then work for their election, or, as the case may be, what men presently in office should be removed. But these things cannot be carried out unless we are sufficiently informed to make these decisions. We have no business sitting idly by, letting fate work out these details. These are decisions that must be made by rational men employing their powers of reason and observation with sufficient knowledge to determine what it is that must be done. There can be no such thing under our form of government as an aloof population who sits by and takes no interest in these things. We need to ask ourselves such questions as, is a proposed law which will affect our economic or business system based on sound economic principles or on something else that may be harmful to the working man? Is a law that may affect our foreign policy based on fact, truth, or justice, or is it based on misinformation or propaganda? Will a law affecting a farmer actually benefit the farmer, or will he be adversely affected by it? Will certain tax laws really benefit the taxpayer, or will it be an added burden to an already overtaxed citizenry? Now many of us will hardly find this kind of responsibility enjoyable, nor is it the kind of thing we would do for recreation. But as Thomas Paine once pointed out, those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must undergo the fatigues of supporting it. Voters often draw the conclusion that their political leaders have only contempt for them. This may be true, but the voter fails to realize why the politician holds him in contempt. It may well be because the voter has proven he can be easily swayed and manipulated, and therefore the voter is treated with contempt for this reason. He is simply not worthy of respect. Freedom is not free, and you only get out of something what you put into it. With the lack of interest Americans take in political affairs and current events, it's no wonder we are losing our freedom as fast as the people we put into office can take it away from us. Uninformed people are not qualified to vote, yet the average American has not the slightest compunction to march into the voting booth and do just that. Upon what is he basing his vote? In the last presidential election, you had millions of Americans voting for a Republican candidate with long-time ties to organized crime and Las Vegas gambling casinos. Considered a hero of the Vietnam War, he was nothing of the kind and betrayed our veterans when he served in the U.S. Senate. Had Americans bothered to read the alternative press instead of listening to the talking heads on the boob tube and read the book Perfidy by authors John Holland and Father Patrick Baccio, they would have known all about this. In the Old Testament, there is the book of Osee, one of the minor prophets. He tells us, quote, "My people have been silent because they had no knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will reject thee." Chapter 4, verse 6. No one can live in this world in a vacuum of his own creation and expect the social order to function correctly. We hear people say, "God bless America," but why should he? How can we expect a God to bless a land where its inhabitants have allowed just about every evil and perversity under the sun to proliferate? A scandalous divorce rate, pornography, abortion, homosexuality, rampant drugs throughout our nation, and in general, vice across the board. As far as our political system is concerned, our capital, Washington, D.C., is and has been for decades a cesspool of corruption. That which makes the news media is only the tip of the iceberg. A forgotten patriot, a man named Frank Holman, was past president of the American Bar Association. He clearly saw the problem as far back as the 1940s. The ignorance, apathy, and gullibility of the American people alarmed him. He said, "We have become a materialistic people and we tolerate situations that are intolerable, unworthy of a free people." He quoted a Chinaman who was considered to be a great philosopher. His name was Lin Yu Tang. In 1945, Tang said that Americans have become the most materialistic people in the world, that they have the best automobiles, the best plumbing fixtures, and the best soap, but that their primary interests are in the immediate comforts of life, material things, rather than in the philosophy of government or in the philosophy of religion. Now, this is how one foreigner saw us back in 1945. Frank Holman said that Americans live by slogans: social justice, economic equality, racial equality, human rights, making the world safe for democracy, freedom-loving countries, the four freedoms, the New Deal, the Fair Deal, so on and so forth. He also made this statement on September 5th, 1949. In the last election, however, although the leaders of both our major parties devoted a large part of their time to a reassertion of a belief and confidence in individual liberty and in constitutional governments, practically every specific measure proposed in their speeches was a further step in the direction of collectivism and the welfare state. And yet we still believe, over 50 years later, there is a difference between the Republicans and Democrats. Again, he said, but we can lose our freedoms, and perhaps we have lost some of them, by inattention and by giving more concern to our business and professional interests than to the public service. To protect our great heritage, both as individuals and as a nation, we must take the time and effort to be active and affirmative in our citizenship. That we do so is more important by far than that we get greater profits or wages or better houses or clothing or even food. We must see to it that our children are so taught that they understand their heritage. This process of continuing education for ourselves and our children is primary, but is often overlooked today. Now, about a year ago, this being 2011, so about 2010, I cut this letter out of one of the newspapers published in Las Vegas, Nevada, as I was down there at the time. This is relevant to Frank Holman's comments on how parents are not educating their children today. Let me just read you the letter. Aaron Neff's Tuesday column addressed the poor performance of Clark County School District students on math tests. The poor performance should not come as a surprise, and it could be addressed to a degree by better trained teachers and smaller class sizes, both of which mean higher taxes. But what is seldom mentioned in such commentaries is how many school systems all across America have this issue. The largest problem isn't a lack of funding, and it never has been. This is a societal problem that cannot be fixed by tax increases alone. When I was a kid, my mom did not work, and both my parents were heavily involved in my schooling. I wasn't allowed to do poorly in school, and my parents worked with me to make sure I did my homework and did well in school. My TV watching was restricted, and there were no computers or video games. I was a kid and was treated as a kid, not as an adult, and my parents were my parents, not my friends. I would love to take all these kids who fail this math test and see how many of them have parents like I had, a commitment to school like my parents insisted I have. This society has changed drastically, and so have its parents and its children. To believe that more tax money is all that is needed is really a terrible oversimplification and ignores some really important issues. So we see then that others have noticed, and many others have noticed this, that there is a change in the attitude of parents, which they think they're helping their children, but they're not. And there's a saying which goes, if you want to make it hard for your children, make it easy. And that's what parents are doing today. They're making it easy. They're not overseeing their education. They couldn't seem to care less about teaching the child his heritage, how he got here, why he got here, and all the elements that went to the civilized situation that we've had in our country from its beginning. Now to continue here. How many Americans have ever read our Constitution? The indications are very few. Yet if we don't understand the fundamental rules of our land, how can we understand anything else? Is it not odd that God would place us in an environment only to have his creatures make excuses as to why they don't need to know anything about it? This is the world God has placed us in. Therefore, we have responsibilities. And those responsibilities are not to be evaded, which is what Americans are doing today. Man is by nature a curious animal. That is why he explores, invents, and studies as much as he does. Yet he shows no curiosity about how to survive in this world, or what Patrick Henry referred to as our temporal salvation. And this is the one area that we can least afford to neglect. The grand irony of all this is that we become a victim of our own ignorance. Why this doesn't bother him is the great mystery. Or why it doesn't bother any of us is a great mystery. Any knowledgeable person has a great advantage over the ignorant one. That is why there is an old saying, knowledge is power. Of course it is. Part of the social problems we are experiencing today may be due to the fact that our minds and souls are hungering for the truth which we are not feeding to them. The fact that man is a rational animal implies that our minds were destined to know the truth which we are denying to it. Allow me to propose a hypothetical situation. Suppose a serious crime is committed, the penalty for which is either life imprisonment or the death penalty. You're implicated. Your future will now be determined by the verdict of a jury. Here is my question. Do you want the members of that jury to be as ignorant as you are? A teacher who made current events a part of her civics class received a letter from a mother who did not want her daughter exposed to current events, which is a normal part of any civics class. The mother felt that it was both unnecessary and unsuitable for a young girl to be learning about events going on in the world around her. She asked that her daughter be removed from this class and be allowed to study something else. I wonder if this girl's parents think that women should have the right to vote. How can you vote on the very issues you are forbidden to study? How do Americans justify voting for the people they elect to office? With the only political principle they know: we must elect the lesser of two evils. And this is precisely how evil gets into our political system, because we elect evil. This is one way we contribute to our own downfall. But if we knew anything, we would not vote in such a stupid manner. In every election, good men are available to vote for, yet we reject them on the basis of this inane mentality, along with such other foolish arguments as, well, I'll just be wasting my vote or throwing my vote away. No, you're not. Not if you're voting for a good man of principle, and honesty and decency, who's a God-fearing American. How is that wasting your vote? But this is the way we think. In the meantime, we complain about how bad the politicians are that hold political office. Yet we put them there. Don't we ever get it? We never see the contradiction. The first organs of society seized by the enemy are the governments and the media. Yet after long experience of being repeatedly deceived by both, we still don't learn our lesson and are amazingly trustful of both. The communist dictator Fidel Castro, in his rise to power, had almost the entire United States mass media supporting his overthrow of Cuban President Fulgencio Batista. Yet, ever since the early 1950s, when Castro was a law student at the University of Havana, he had been a Marxist-Leninist. Because we were so trusting of the press, there was virtually no opposition raised against him. Had Americans known, there was at least a possibility that they might have raised opposition to our U.S. State Department, which was supporting him. As a result of our ignorance, we now have a full-fledged communist state 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Yet there were people who knew all this and published articles trying to alert others. But as usual, the American people were out to lunch. Americans may well be the most manipulated people on earth. Everyone outside the United States seems to know what Americans don't. A few privately express their contempt for us because they see how easily deceived and taken advantage of we are. This indifference towards important matters indicates that we take pride neither in ourselves or in our country, and thus we allow both to fall into disrepute. Now at this point I'd like to pause and read a quotation or two from a book, a very important book, one of the books people should be reading and don't. The title of the book is Confessions of an Economic Hitman. The author is John Perkins. And to give you some background, he was traveling in the country of Ecuador in South America. And he was going to visit a village there, a native village, deep inside the Ecuadorian jungle. It was a part of his business that he consulted with these natives concerning problems they were having with oil companies wanting to drill on their land. This is what he says in his book. The meetings were fascinating and the revelations deeply disturbing. But something else had happened outside the formal setting of those sessions. During breaks, at lunch, and in the evening, when I talked with people privately, I frequently was asked why the United States was threatening Iraq. The impending war was discussed on the front pages of Ecuadorian newspapers that made their way into this jungle town, and the coverage was very different from coverage in the States. It included references to the Bush family's ownership of oil companies and to Vice President Cheney's role as former CEO of Halliburton. These newspapers were read to men and women who had never attended school. Everyone seemed to take an interest in this issue. Here I was in the Amazon rainforest among illiterate people, many in North America considered backward and even savage. And yet probing questions were being asked that struck at the heart of the global empire. End of quotation. Now consider this. He just told you what kind of people they were, primitive people living in the heart of the jungle, and they were interested in the politics of a country several thousand miles away, and they wanted to know what was going on and why. How much are they Americans? Do we Americans take as much interest in our own affairs as these people deep in the jungle do? This is the question. This is actually, to me, a kind of scandal on the American people that these natives take more interest in important matters than we do. So there you have it on that from John Perkins. Our Lord told us, I send you as sheep among wolves. Christians ignore the fact that wolves are predators. In other words, they don't wait for you to come to them. They seek you out. Christians live as if we have no enemies that hate us and would like to see us exterminated off the face of the earth. This would indicate that we have lost the instinct of self-preservation as we give no thought to our survival. We obviously don't care whether we continue to exist or not. So it appears as though we as Americans have a death wish. We don't take a normal, irrational precautions to protect ourselves against known enemies. Now here I'd like to pause and read another quotation, this time from a different book. The title of the book is, again, May God Forgive Us, and it's written by Robert Welch. He makes two trenchant observations here, both of which I wish to use here. What's the matter with us anyway? Neither facts nor pictures seem to sink into our centers of feeling anymore. They remain just words and lines and forms, objective phenomena outside the glazed surface of our noumenal existence. The physical suffering, the mental anguish, the never-ceasing terror of our fellow human beings, represented by these words and pictures, no longer reach through the glaze to activate our imaginations or to excite our sympathies. The lowest estimate of any recognized authority is willing to make places the number of slave laborers in Russia at 8 million persons. I interrupt you to say, please note the date this was written was 1952. To continue, however, it may be twice that great, 8 million. Most of these people have been brutally torn from their homes and their families somewhere, for the very reason that they loved their homes and families, that they were not the kind of people who could be expected to sacrifice civilized loyalties to the service of a communist tyranny. Very few have ever escaped from these camps and reached an opportunity to tell the West about them. But some have, and enough for the purpose. There are available, carefully restrained, documented and incontrovertible expositions of the conditions of brutality, filth, disease, terror, and hopelessness under which these victims, men like you and me, work out the days or years until they are no longer worth famine rations to their captors. This knowledge has been available throughout all the years that our government has been helping to hand over more peoples and provinces to good old Uncle Joe. It is available to all those communists and their sympathizers in our midst who befoul our schools, our public forums, and even our courts with their rantings about idealism and freedom. We read about these things in the newspapers for a cursory minute, and then turn with a shrug to the sports pages or the comics. America was long looked to as the light of the world, a land and a people of happiness and strength, a nation that had for itself and promoted for others, wherever its influence reached, justice and honor and decency and freedom. The remembrance of that light dies slowly, even when it can no longer be seen. Today in Poland, China, Czechoslovakia, and numberless areas behind the Iron Curtain, there are millions of families, like yours and mine, which have been decimated, starved, and frightened into abject submission, but which still cling to the dream that presently, maybe even next week or next year, the United States is going to come in all its beneficent majesty to rescue them from the inhumane tyranny which owns them now. In their moments of greatest misery or despair, they ask the question, when will the Americans come? The Americans, unfortunately, all of us are busy playing our little games, while our government, far from worrying about how the Iron Curtain may ever be lifted, is frequently lending a hand, as to Mao Zedong in China, to those who are trying to bring down another section of the curtain to swallow up another piece of the globe. As we sit in our warm homes after a happy meal with our families and turn on our television sets or radios, it is hard for us to think of a man just like ourselves, always half starved, always half frozen, haggard and hopeless, remembering the days when he too was free, as he is brutally driven to finish up the literal exhaustion of his body in labor for the benefit of the very tyrant who has enslaved him. It is harder still to remember that there are millions of such men, or that in the past 6 years, 600 millions of our fellow human beings have been placed under the merciless heel of this monster and the bestial control of his henchmen and police. For the pusillanimous part that we have played in all this, spreading horror, for our indifference to the grief of others, for our apathy to the crimes we saw, and our blindness to those we should have seen, for our gullibility in the acceptance of veneered treason, and our easy forgetfulness even when the veneer had been rubbed off, for all our witting and unwitting help to the vicious savages of the Kremlin and to their subordinate savages everywhere, may God and our fellow men someday forgive us. End of quotation. Some time ago, I had placed in the back of my church some information compiled by a Protestant group which monitors this situation, information about Christians around the world who are being persecuted. There are more than one-third, in more than one-third of the nations around the world, Christians are being actively persecuted. They're being arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and often executed. I put this out for any number of reasons. I thought certainly it would be of interest to others who are Christians. I thought it would be a wake-up call to make others alert that if they're doing this to Protestants, they're certainly going to do it to you Catholics. Plus the fact that it was informative. It gave information, it gave statistics and locations. It mentioned the countries that this was happening in and the groups that it was happening to. I thought it was worthwhile literature, but within 2 days, it ended up in the garbage can. Apparently, someone took offense to this. But this is precisely part of this mentality that we have, that we will not face the reality. We do not wish to face up to that which is unpleasant, and so we push it out of our view, out of our sight. We don't want to hear about it. And so this is part of our problem. We cannot live in reality, and we cannot confront reality. We have this interesting situation where people watch reality shows on television. Now, what's the message in this? Where we have to get our reality through an artificial medium. Well, why don't they just deal with the reality that's in our world as it is, which is readily available to them if they take the time and trouble to look into it? But no, they shield themselves and hide themselves from this because they don't wish to confront that which is unpleasant. But by not confronting that which is unpleasant, they will have to confront things which are far more unpleasant in the future by hiding from the truth. And finally, I wind down here. If we are to survive, and I am rather pessimistic at this point, we must first arm ourselves so we cannot be lied to and manipulated. This must begin by study. We cannot fight back with ignorance. People must develop a daily reading schedule of books and a few trustworthy publications. Secondly, it is a fundamental rule of warfare to know thine enemy. We have to know who he is, where he is, and what he is doing. Thirdly, you can't win a defensive war. You cannot win a football game if you only play defense. We cannot prevail by merely reacting to a problem that has already been caused. Once people are informed, they must go on the offensive using what they have learned. Fourthly, a well-informed populace will not vote for the criminals and ambitious men that we have been voting for over the past few decades. Fifthly, be prepared to change some of the convictions you presently hold to. Sixthly, develop a desire to know the truth. In my opinion, to be indifferent to the truth has to be a sin. Seventh, I'm assuming, of course, that everyone is saying their rosary. And finally, make as your motto, get involved or get enslaved. And I thank you very much for your attention.